Here is something that should stop you cold. The Holocaust was not primarily the product of a raving dictator. According to a remarkable piece of research published under the name An Unknown Soldier, it was the product of a fatal recurring flaw inside accredited academia itself. A flaw that had been building epiphany by epiphany for centuries before a single person was ever put on a list. Today, we are pulling apart chromosome discovery, the birth of gene theory as a practical science, and the cognitive dissonance that helped pave the road to genocide. By the end of this episode, you will understand how a microscope slide, a Nobel Prize, and a pseudoscientific obsession with human measurement converged into one of history's greatest catastrophes, and why the author argues the pattern is still very much with us. I am joined by someone who has spent considerable time with this research, and I want to start right at the heart of it. The author opens with a thesis that is, frankly, uncomfortable. What exactly is the argument?
So the author, writing as an unknown soldier, opens with what he calls a consistent failure of accredited academia to maintain the integrity of peer review. And the argument is this: every time humanity crosses what he calls an epiphanic threshold, a moment of genuinely paradigm-shifting scientific discovery, the intelligentsia experiences a kind of cognitive dissonance. They cannot reconcile the new knowledge with the frameworks they have already committed to. And rather than sit with that uncertainty, they reach for certainty prematurely. Hypothesis gets rubber-stamped and presented to the general public as settled science. And the consequences of that, the author argues, grow worse with each successive epiphany.
So it is a ratcheting mechanism. Each failure is worse than the last.
Exactly. And the author traces this arc from a single invention, the optical lens. He begins with Ibn Sal's lens, moves through Galileo's telescope, Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, and then follows the chain of consequences all the way to the 1930s. The lens is the through line. Every discovery that matters in this story happens because someone looked through a piece of curved glass.
Which is a genuinely striking way to frame it. And the author is not just making a historical argument, he is making a structural one, that this is what academia does reliably at moments of breakthrough.
Right. And he has a word for it. He calls it idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that, he says, is a form of idolatry. And he is careful to say it applies equally to theologians who are more devoted to their interpretation of scripture than to what is actually in front of them. He is not letting either side off the hook.
That is a striking diagnosis. Now, let us get into the science itself, because I think listeners need to understand what was actually known about chromosomes by the early 20th century and what was not. Walk me through where things stood.
So chromosomes had been identified as nucleic structures in the late 1800s. Scientists could see them under the microscope. They knew they were there. But their role in the propagation and replication of cellular life was only suspected, it had not been proven. The man who changed that was Thomas Hunt Morgan.
The Nobel laureate.
In 1933, yes. Morgan was awarded the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the role chromosomes play in cell replication and inheritance. He had co-authored a landmark work called The Mechanism of Mendelian Heredity back in 1916, in which he proposed that chromosomes were not just a determinant of heredity, but the determinant of heredity, and he went on to prove it. But here is the thing the author really wants us to sit with. The specifics of how chromosomes worked were still thought to be mechanical. Nobody, not even the National Socialists, suspected that chromosomes were software.
Software, that is the author's framing.
It is. And it is important because the entire catastrophe that follows is built on people treating something they did not understand as though they did. They could see the shape of chromosomes, they could categorize them, but they had no idea what the shapes actually meant or how the mechanism worked. And yet, and this is the author's point, opinions were rubber-stamped and accepted as theory long before the evidence warranted it.
And the shape question is where things get particularly fraught, isn't it? Because this is where Lillian Vaughan Morgan enters the story.
Yes, and she is a fascinating figure. Lillian Vaughan Morgan was Thomas Hunt Morgan's wife. Both were biologists, though she was the junior of the two professionally. She met Thomas while he was teaching at Bryn Mawr. When he moved to Cornell, she was not granted tenure or even a teaching position, but he gave her unofficial status and a laboratory of her own, where she worked daily with slides under the microscope. The author describes them as intellectually married. What they worked on together.
And in 1926, she made a discovery that, as the author puts it, would prime the socialists for their next psychotic break.
Ring chromosomes. Lillian discovered ring chromosomes in 1926. And to understand why that mattered, you need to understand what the scientific consensus already was, or thought it was. By that point, the pseudo-scientific gospel of X and Y chromosomes had already proliferated among the professorial class and been picked up enthusiastically by the press. The accepted wisdom was men have a Y-shaped chromosome, women have an X-shaped chromosome. That was the binary. That was the settled science.
Even though, as the author points out, nobody actually knew what those shapes did.
Precisely. They knew the shapes were important because men were Y and women were X. The function was entirely unknown. And then Lillian looks through her microscope and finds something that does not fit the binary at all. A ring. And then, even more destabilizing, an XO chromosome. Not XX, not XY, XO.
And the question that immediately follows is, if a man is XY and a woman is XX, what is a person with XO?
The author's answer is blunt: you don't know. Neither did the Socialist International, neither did the National Socialists. The correct scientific response to that discovery was humility. We need more data. We need to understand the mechanism before we draw conclusions. That is not what happened.
And the author makes a point that lands rather hard here. He says, we are presently at war over this very question. The XO discovery is not ancient history.
He does. And I think that is one of the more quietly devastating observations in the entire piece. The epiphany that sent the 1930s scientific community into a spiral is the same unresolved question that is generating enormous social conflict today. The author is not making a political point about that, he is making a structural one. The pattern repeats.
Let us now move into the political context, because 1933 is an extraordinary year to be receiving a Nobel Prize in genetics. Walk me through what else is happening simultaneously.
So the author notes that the earliest textbook on genetics did not receive widespread acclaim until 1933, the same year the Reichstag burned down. He says the coincidence may not be a coincidence, and when you look at what else is happening that year, the convergence is genuinely alarming. The world is in the depths of the Great Depression. Stalin had launched the Holodomor the previous year, a campaign of deliberate starvation targeting Ukrainians he had declared, and I am quoting the research here, unredeemable genetic stock. And Adolf Hitler had just been elected Chancellor of Germany.
And the world, as the author notes, did essentially nothing in response to the Holodomor.
Nothing. And the author is explicit about why. America's army had been disbanded after the First World War. The financial resources to build armies simply did not exist in the depths of the Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to intervene. The author says Roosevelt had a terrifying problem of his own in 1933, with Americans beginning to starve. In April of that year, the Roosevelt administration formed the Civilian Conservation Corps, an emergency measure against starvation, which would go on to employ 3 million people at its height.
And Hitler was watching all of this very carefully, meticulously. The author says Hitler and company noted how popular work camps were under capitalism. They noted how effective Roosevelt was with radio. And this is where the research takes a fascinating and slightly chilling tangent, because the author traces the Nazi propaganda machine's adoption of the fireside chat format directly back to Roosevelt's innovation.
The Fireside Chats, Roosevelt's series of radio broadcasts.
Beginning in March of 1933, Roosevelt delivered 30 fireside chats over the wireless, ending in 1940. People all over the world were mesmerized by the ability to listen in real time as the President of the United States spoke directly to the nation. And according to the research, lightning struck in Joseph Goebbels' mind. The author says Goebbels ordered German industries to manufacture the Volksempfänger, inexpensive radio sets that ordinary Germans could afford. He calls it, rather brilliantly, the iPhone of that age.
So Roosevelt's innovation in democratic communication was essentially reverse engineered into a totalitarian propaganda tool.
The author is careful not to blame Roosevelt for Hitler's rise. He says explicitly, "Do not mistake me for attributing Hitler's rise to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hitler already had a comprehensive propaganda machine in place. Roosevelt just provided the intimate familial format that Hitler lacked." But the point stands, a new window was opened into the individual psyche, and, as the author puts it, the devil wasted no time leaping through it.
And there is a parallel story here about film, about Charlie Chaplin, that the author weaves in, which I find almost too strange to believe.
It is extraordinary. So in 1927, when films were finally given a voice, the National Socialist Workers' Party immediately recognized the potential. But before that, in the era of silent film, a British actor named Charles Spencer Chaplin had risen to international fame playing a silly, stumbling hobo, the character everyone just called Charlie Chaplin. And Goebbels, according to the research, convinced Hitler to lose his long handlebar moustache and adopt the neat, narrow upper lip style of Charlie Chaplin.
So Hitler's mustache, that image which is now indelibly associated with him, was essentially borrowed from Charlie Chaplin.
That is what the research suggests. And Chaplin was publicly horrified. He went to work mocking the man who had appropriated his very appearance. But it was not until 1940 that Chaplin turned his cameras on Hitler directly, in The Great Dictator. By then, the author says, it was too late. The once famous visage of a small, brown-haired man with a narrow-lipped moustache is now permanently associated with Adolf Hitler. Chaplin crawled through Ibn Sal's lens and into the hearts of millions worldwide, and the greatest sociopaths in human history followed closely behind in his disguise.
That is a haunting image. Now, let us return to the science, because the author argues that the National Socialists did not just observe gene theory from a distance, they weaponized it. How?
So, the National Socialists had become convinced that human evolution was one part physical, one part cognitive, and one part ideological. Any reinforcing scientific proof was, in their framework, a call to action. Nazi doctors went to work measuring every minute detail of every German they could get their hands on. Schools were particularly useful, filled, as the author puts it, with ignorant, compliant children who did what they were told. Children were measured, catalogued, and graded against what were described as extremely scientific criteria.
And children with ring chromosomes ended up on Hitler's list.
All of them. Because children with ring chromosomes invariably had discernible differences in their physiology. And in that age, any variance from the imagined Aryan standard was deemed a birth defect, a degenerate genetic outcome which could, should, and would be weeded out of the gene pool. The author's phrase is devastating in its flatness. It was just science.
Meanwhile, the author notes the Nazi leadership itself largely failed to meet the Aryan standard they were enforcing on everyone else.
He does note that, yes. And this is where the research enters genuinely murky territory, the Soviet claims about Hitler's own biology. The Soviets, who reached Hitler's bunker before the Allies, claimed that tissue tested on remains thought to be Hitler's revealed he was born with a ring chromosome, and that he had hypopigmentation, regions of skin that did not produce melanin.
The author is skeptical of this.
Very. He says he cannot accept the story as accurate, but he acknowledges the rumours have lingered since VE Day, and that we are all obligated to dispel a myth if it cannot be proven. He does note that there is ample anecdotal evidence Hitler wore pancake makeup, not cosmetic makeup, but the kind worn by actors, to compensate for poor lighting on film. And Goebbels was filming every public appearance from 1927 forward, so that in itself is not remarkable. But the Soviet claim about hyperpigmentation, the author treats it as propaganda, not science.
And the propaganda value for the Soviets was obvious. Irresistible, the author says, because by 1945, melanin had become known to be a critical component in human neurology, specifically in a region of the brainstem called the substantia nigra. And both the Socialist International and the National Socialists had been drawing conclusions from incomplete neurological hypotheses about what melanin's presence or absence meant for cognitive function.
Explain the substantia nigra for listeners who are not familiar with it. So, the substantia nigra is a region in the brainstem. It is known today that it is deficient in patients suffering from Parkinson's disease. In the early 20th century, neurologists from the University of Vienna to Columbia University were convinced it played a determinant role in higher cognitive function and motor coordination. The hypothesis, and the author is careful to call it only a hypothesis, was that melanin in the brainstem functioned like a fuse in a fuse box. If the nervous system produced too much chemoelectric current, the substantia nigra would buffer the brainstem from being overloaded.
And from that hypothesis, racists drew conclusions about intelligence and temperament based on how much melanin a person had.
The author is explicit about this. He says the origins of racist tropes about intelligence and temperament are found in speculation about melanin's role in human neurology. And then he says something that I think is one of the most important lines in the entire research. Racism is not at all skin deep. It begins at conception. Because, as was also discovered in the early 20th century, the first two organs to form in a human fetus are the skin and the neural bud.
So the racism being constructed in this period was not superficial prejudice. It was being built on a biological framework, however distorted and premature that framework was.
Exactly. And the author says science was falling headlong down a deluded psychotic rabbit hole. Before the Second World War even broke out, accredited academia had generated what it believed were reasons why darker-skinned people were inferior to lighter-skinned people. And then, and this is the Soviet gambit, darker-skinned scientists pushed back and said, who is to say too little melanin is not the problem? The battle was not black and white, it was a gradient, and both extremes were fighting over the implications.
Which is where the Soviet post-war propaganda becomes so calculated. They used the melanin hypothesis to link Hitler to a figure of enormous religious significance.
Yes. The author says the Soviets chose to slay two dragons with the same lie. After VE Day, Soviet agents provocateurs began connecting Hitler's alleged hypopigmentation to descriptions of Jesus of Nazareth, specifically the description in the Quran of skin like alabaster. The implication being that both figures shared a neurological condition that explained their behavior. The author, writing as a Christian, finds this deeply disturbing. He says, the day Adolf Hitler put a pistol to his head and stopped evolving is the day the Socialist International started crucifying Jesus of Nazareth all over again.
That is a remarkable sentence.
It is, and I think it captures something important about the author's overall project. He is not writing a conventional history, he is writing a diagnosis. And the diagnosis is that the same intellectual failure, the same idolatry, to use his word, that produced the Holocaust is still operating. The pattern has not been broken, it has just found new material to work with.
Let us also not lose sight of the Lenin thread here, because the author draws a direct line from Lenin's theoretical framework to Stalin's actions, and then to Hitler's calculations.
Right. So Lenin had, by 1933, improved on Marx's theory by suggesting that anyone could be psychologically conditioned, forced to evolve in their thinking with a little help from friends. According to Lenin's theses, whoever could not be evolved into the proletariat would have to be liquidated. Stalin inherited that framework, declared Ukrainians unredeemable genetic stock, and launched the Holodomor. Hitler watched. The world did nothing. And Hitler drew the obvious conclusion.
The author also mentions the meeting at Café Central in Vienna, a detail that feels almost cinematic.
It is extraordinary. The author describes a gathering at Café Central in Vienna around 1910 in a thick cloud of opium smoke, as he puts it, where Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin and Dmitry Mitrinovich, as well as Lenin in absentia, began planning what the author calls a global war of extinction. The revolution to come, it was agreed, had to be sudden, violent and catalytic. The world's royalty, nobility, aristocracy and bourgeoisie would be eliminated in one fell swoop. Their plan, the author notes with considerable irony, was described as extremely scientific.
And on the periphery of that coffee clutch was a loner named Adolf,
soaking it all in from a table across the room and making plans of his own. The author's point is that by 1910, the march toward the Holocaust was already nearly complete. All that was needed was a spark, and the chromosome discoveries, the gene theory, the melanin hypotheses, all of that provided the intellectual fuel. The spark came later.
So when you step back from everything the author has laid out, the optical lens, the chromosomes, the Nobel Prize, the Holodomor, the Volksempfänger, the Café Central, what is the through line? What is the author actually asking us to understand? The through line is peer review, or rather, the catastrophic failure of it. The author's diagnosis is that at every epiphanic threshold, every moment when humanity gains genuinely paradigm-shifting knowledge, the intelligentsia experiences dissonance, and rather than sit with that dissonance and do the hard work of rigorous verification, they reach for premature certainty. Hypothesis becomes theory. Theory becomes gospel. And the people who do not fit the gospel get put on a list. And the author argues that failures in peer review alone cannot explain the dissonance. There is something deeper.
Idolatry. That is his word. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that is a form of idolatry. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretation of scripture than to manifest truth, that is also a form of idolatry. And the author says we are all susceptible because we define ourselves too much by what we believe. When those beliefs are exposed as fallacies, we are hard-pressed to abandon them.
Which is, in a sense, the most human thing about this entire story. The scientists who built the intellectual scaffolding for the Holocaust were not, most of them, monsters. They were people who believed what they believed for reasons they found entirely justifiable.
And that is precisely what makes the author's thesis so uncomfortable. It would be much easier if the story were simply about evil men doing evil things. But the research insists that the structural failure, the idolatry, the collapse of peer review, the premature certainty, is the real villain. And that villain is not safely in the past. It is a feature of how human institutions process paradigm-shifting knowledge. It happened before the Holocaust. The author argues it is happening now.
The exochromosome question being the most pointed example of that continuity.
Exactly. Lillian Vaughan Morgan looked through her microscope in 1926 and found something that did not fit the accepted binary. The correct response was, "We need to understand this before we draw conclusions." That response was not forthcoming then. The author is asking whether it is forthcoming now.
And the author's prescription, if there is one, seems to be rooted in what he calls the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual.
Accepting that we are our own worst counsel. He says what every major religion instructs and what peer review of science enforces is that same principle. We are not equipped to be the final arbiters of our own beliefs. We need the check of genuine scrutiny from other scientists, from other traditions, from people who will push back before the hypothesis becomes gospel. That is what peer review is supposed to do. And when it fails, the consequences, as this research documents, can be catastrophic.
Here is what this really comes down to, I think. The author is not writing a history of the Holocaust. He is writing a history of a pattern. And the chromosome story, Thomas Hunt Morgan's Nobel Prize, Lillian's ring chromosomes, the exo discovery, the Nazi doctors with their measuring tapes in school corridors, that is not the cause of the Holocaust. It is the most recent iteration of a failure that had been building for centuries.
That is exactly right. And I think the author's most important contribution is the insistence that we stop attributing the Holocaust to the fury of one man. That attribution is itself a form of the same cognitive failure he is diagnosing. It is too simple. It lets the institutions off the hook. It lets the professorial class off the hook. It lets all of us off the hook. And the author will not allow that.
The research ends with a note of hope. A hospital ship on D-Day, which we will explore in a future episode. But I want to close on the line that I think captures the entire project. The author writes, "By the time the founders of the 20th century's socialist movement met at Café Central in Vienna, the march toward the Holocaust was nearly complete. All which was needed was a spark."
And the spark, when it came, ignited material that had been accumulating for centuries. That is the author's argument. Not that the Holocaust was inevitable in some fatalistic sense, but that it was made nearly inevitable by a series of institutional failures that nobody was willing to name or correct. The lens opened a window, the devil leapt through it, and the scientists handed him the key.
All of this from the consequences of Ibn Sahl's lens. That is where the author leaves us, and it is, I think, exactly the right place to end. Because the lens is still there. The window is still open. The question the research is really asking is, who is looking through it now, and what conclusions are they rushing to draw?
And are they doing the hard work of peer review before they act on those conclusions, or are they already making lists?
That is the question an unknown soldier leaves us with. The research we have drawn on today is published under the title March to the Holocaust by an Unknown Soldier, and we would encourage you to seek it out. This conversation is far from over.